Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm Jon Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. But usually on this podcast, I'm all alone. I'm a lone strider, if you will. And now that we're about a week or so into doing this thing, I think it's time to finally mix things up. With me, I have a fantastic special guest, our first one ever on Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. He is the host of the Legendarium Podcast. It is a legendary podcast, too. And YouTube channel of the same name. Truly one of the premier long-running sci-fi fantasy book club shows out there. So welcome to the show for the first time, our first guest ever as well, Craig Hanks. And hey, Craig, thank you so much for actually saying yes to this.
You're very welcome, John. It's nice to see you again. It's been a few years since you were a guest on our show.
That's right. Yeah, we had a little podcast exchange program back in 2017, I think it was. But hey, it's been fun to keep in touch over the years. And so for me, when we were launching this pod, you were definitely one of the first people I was like, all right, would love to have Craig on here. I mean, it would be so fun.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I'm here. And this is a perfect way for me to kind of oil my gears up again, because I'm just coming off of a few months hiatus on the Legendarium. We've been going for over 10 years now, and I needed a break this summer, so I took a little break. Now it's time to get things back going. We recorded an episode for this week, and things will be picking back up again, so I hope people go check it out.
What incredible timing. And yeah, we're obviously going to link to Legendarium. For folks, who haven't checked in with Legendarium before, I mean, if you're a fantasy writer and author, I mean, jump to it right away. But yeah, Craig, how would you describe it, as seriously as possible? No jokes.
Yeah, no jokes. I did not agree to that, John. Okay. So the Legendarium is essentially, as you say, a book club podcast. The idea that grew as we went was kind of an old idea now, but it was fresh at the time in 2014. And that was, what if you could actually sit in a room with a bunch of other people who liked fantasy books as much as you do? So often you struggle to connect in real life with those people. And we wanted to give at least a sense. And so we had a bunch of IRL friends, and we got together, not digitally like this, but in the same room, talked fantasy books. We went through Tolkien and Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson and Patrick Rothfuss and all the big names, some of the smaller ones. And it's been a heck of a ride with a bunch of lifelong friends now.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see that you guys have kept it up, that you're still good friends and all of that. And one of the main reasons why I was like, all right, I would love to have Craig on this kind of show in particular is because, well, hey, I mean, you are what I would consider quite the expert on both modern fantasy, classic fantasy. Like, you really know your stuff. And I think that can be so helpful for people who want to write a fantasy novel or a novella or a short story who, maybe it can be intimidating. Like, there are some folks, like, they're a little younger. A lot of the time I come across these folks who want to write these things and they're feeling intimidated. They're like, I haven't read all, 14 Wheel of Time books. I haven't read all, A Song of Ice and Fire past, I just watched the show or whatever. There's so many folks out there who, could use a little bit of that nudge, a kind of book club community, especially if that's their goal, that they want to be published either traditionally or to self-publish, whatever it takes for them, right? So that's really the spirit of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and people should know, both, if they go check out the Legendarium and for the sake of this conversation, that part of, I hope, the appeal of the show is that we are not a bunch of published writers. We don't necessarily know all of the ins and outs of, okay, so here's what a publisher is really looking for in that first page of your submission. We don't necessarily get into all of that stuff. I know a little bit just from being around the industry for so long and being a beta reader for Brandon Sanderson and some other authors. So I get a little bit of that, but we still try to keep it from a reader's perspective rather than from a writer's or an editor's perspective, if that makes sense. Hopefully it sounds professional, but it's delightfully amateurish.
Glad you brought that up. Yeah, very approachable. And for Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, that's why I think this should be a good balance, because having you here, I think you're somebody who knows a lot about prose. You're somebody who knows a lot about what's been done before and why it works. And that's what we're going to set out to do. And, on that note, normally on this show, we're about 4 or 5 episodes in, depending on when you listen to this. And what we've been doing so far is our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, has been finding these fantasy writing advice prompts, folks, mainly on the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. We've done so far one comment from our own community so far, which was really exciting. And as we record this, it hasn't come out yet, so I actually don't know how it's gone over yet. So future Jon, hope it works out. But yeah, in terms of the usual format, I'm usually responding to writing advice, things like, oh yeah, how do I deal with world building? How do I deal with, writing, a good main character, that kind of thing. But having you on, I thought this could be a great opportunity, our first opportunity, to actually critique a story excerpt. There's a lot of these things that pop in through the fantasy writers community. Then this is one where I literally asked our producer, I was like, okay, please find one that's short, like 100 to 200 words would be great. And something that, I told her, I was like, Craig really knows a lot about prose. So anything that could really fit the bill on somebody who, maybe is not super, super beginner, but maybe they're a little bit closer to Barbarian, and we can hopefully provide some insight and tips on their story blurb. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at somebody's first, I think it's going to be, 240 words, a little longer than I expected, but that's okay. That's not too bad.
Maybe we won't even get through 100 of them. Let's find out.
Oh, wow. Well, you never know, right? But yeah, that's what we're here to do. And so one thing I want to raise to you, Craig, too, I'm going to read through this, and then we'll probably take it bit by bit, kind of follow it along. We'll also look at the comments once we get through it. But I also want to pinpoint, if you were actually reading this book, I'm just imagining Craig Hanks at his local bookstore, and you're judging the book by its cover and maybe just the first 240 words. I want to know where you're going to stop reading, basically. Like, where do you stop? I'm going to do that as well, and of course give the rationale and everything. Now, it might be that we get through the whole thing and we're like, well, we didn't stop at all, which would be fantastic. But the twist is, neither of us have read this yet. So Natalia sent us this. We are looking at it live for the first time. The reason we're doing it that way is that we don't have to, but it's just kind of helpful, at least for me, because I feel like my advice is going to be a little bit more like off the cuff. And sometimes I think if I'm over prepared for something, or if I think about it too much, I overthink it. And then I want to say like 20 things instead of just focusing on one solid piece of here's what I think, if that makes any sense. So hopefully that's helpful.
Well, I hope maybe I'll be the one that will swamp the listeners with way too many suggestions. We'll see.
Well, hey, I feel like if it's coming from you, that there's no way that could be the case. All right. Okay, so I have this now, and I'm going to share my screen too here as well so that Craig can see it, but you do have it if you need it on your own side there. But okay, so this is the excerpt. It's from username Simon O'Neill 87. I'm just going to call them Simon. And the question actually for this story excerpt is, does the opening of my first chapter hook you in? Simon describes it as a dark fantasy at 240 words and has a nice little message at the beginning. I love it when they include a message. I don't like it when it just drops right into the excerpt, because I want a little bit of framing. I don't just like look at a book and it's blank and there's nothing at all. Like, there's going to be some kind of razzle dazzle, I think. But anyway, okay. So the first part of the prompt says, "Hi, lovely people. I am drafting my dark fantasy novel and wanted to receive feedback as to whether its opening has a sufficient hook. Any critique, welcome, smiley face." Great. I'm glad they mentioned hooks. I love hooks, Craig. I think hooks are very great and always wonderful things to include, especially in the opening part of your novel. So I'm going to go through this now. Are we ready?
Ready. Let's do it. Although I should say I expect a performance, a dramatic reading from you. This better be good.
I wasn't going to do that, but if you're asking for it, I do have a little bit of audiobook experience, so I guess I could do that. Okay. Possession is a suffocating blackness that wraps around you, tightening like a serpent coiling to constrict. It presses in from all sides with a cold, clammy grip, promising a slow, relentless squeeze that chokes out any glimmer of hope. The darkness is ravenous, its hunger for despair insatiable. The demon swallows you whole, dragging you into its pitiless depths, leaving you lost, searching for a light that never comes. She had fought him at first, with all the stubbornness of youth. Now the darkness was all she knew. The demon had become her constant companion, a presence so familiar that it was hard to remember a time when he wasn't there. In her moments of weakness, she could feel his satisfaction, feeding off her misery like a parasite. But there was something worse, a twisted pleasure Moloch took in making her hurt others. There were times when Maya could only watch as her hands moved on their own. The demon relished the pain it inflicted, using her body as a weapon to carry out its mission. When the damage was done and blood stained her hands, it would retreat, leaving her to grapple with the guilt of her actions. Moloch clung to her, knowing its existence depended on the destruction of her own. It had her body. Sometimes it controlled her mind. But her soul was still her own, and she would not let it take that, no matter the cost. All right, that is my best, I guess, emulation of Ray Bradbury, I guess. I don't even know what that was.
I love it. You're hired.
So reading this for the first time, I'm going to preface this with this, Craig.
Okay.
I've read a bunch of these excerpts before. We did a couple as like test episodes before we launched the podcast. I didn't get through a single one without stopping and being like, this is where I would stop reading. I didn't have that with this one. I don't know if you did, but I went through all of it and I was like, yeah, I'll keep going. What about you?
I agree that I would keep going from here. There's certainly a lot to critique. The blue pencil is sharpened and ready to go on this.
Absolutely.
In fact, I'm going to recommend a complete overhaul of this. But that being said, that doesn't mean that you don't have something here.
Yes, I really agree. I think that this actually is kind of, it's not that it's missing a hook. It's missing two things for me. It's mainly missing some kind of immediate action. I think I have the basis for like an emotional involvement, which I always want from an opening. And I feel like my attention has been captured, but I just think it's like all the pieces are there. I think all of it could be sharpened and amplified a lot more. There could be way more impact, I think.
Yeah, what this reads as to me is this is the bones of a story. This is the person's idea, the author's idea. But now we need to actually implement that idea. And, there are cliches that are cliches for a good reason because they're used so much, because they're so valuable. One of those would be show, don't tell. And writers get sick of hearing that, right? But it's good advice and you should remember it. And in a case like this, yeah, you're given the bones of a story. You're given this person's emotions, their feelings about what it's like to live with this demon. But I would rather you show me what it's like to live with that demon. So you start, I don't know how dark we want to get with this dark fantasy, but the character is leaning over the corpse of the person that they just killed. Their hands are red with their blood. They extract the still beating heart. Blah, blah, blah. But that, as you say, kind of opening with some kind of action that shows this is what the demon is doing to me, not my reflections on what the demon sometimes makes me do.
Absolutely. I think that I would like this to be a scene instead of a long-winded intro is what it feels like to me. And it's tricky because I like how it's written. The words are nice. It's not too purpley in terms of the prose. I don't feel like the writer is adding a bunch of adjectives for the sake of it. It sounds like they're choosing words that are definitely vivid. So it's not like the writing is in a bad place. I can tell they really polished this, but I can also tell that they didn't really take some time to analyze, like, is this the best way to bring the reader into the story? For me, I would say no. I think that the best way to bring them into the story, like you're saying, is to show me an example of what this stuff means to the person. I do feel a little bit bad about that, though, because I like that they are using the advantages of writing a novel over what I mainly see when I look at stuff like this. I usually see people write like it's a screenplay. And so they just spend like 2 paragraphs painting a scene, throw a bunch of dialogue at us, and they're writing it like they're imagining the opening of a movie. But I like how this is taking advantage of some interiority and things like that. And so that is good, but I think it's too far. Like, it's almost like too much interiority, not enough immediacy, urgency to really like suck me in. And one other thing, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like the first paragraph here, it kind of feels like I'm reading first person. I feel like it's this character Maya talking to me. So when it says she had fought him at first, I almost feel a little bit like blindsided. Like, hey, wait, I thought we were, oh, okay. It feels a little strange for the narrator to start like in this way.
Yeah, no, I agree. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it does feel like you're internal, you're in their head. Is it Maya? you're in Maya's head and then suddenly you're out in third person looking down. And yeah, that does feel a little bit odd, especially when you don't introduce Maya until halfway through the third paragraph. Whose head am I in and what's going on? So you're already a little bit disoriented, and then it switches that perspective immediately and you're even more disoriented. So maybe tightening up what you want to do in those first two paragraphs.
Yes, absolutely. I think we definitely agree on that. I think that, what do you think about the stakes of this? Do you think that the stakes are clearly communicated? I know we have the obvious one, which is that demon possession is harmful and everything, but do you feel like we get more than that though? Like, I'm struggling a little bit, just trying to be like, am I getting really like what the promise of this first page or first few paragraphs for the story really is going to be? Is it really going to be this battle between her and the demon, or is it going to be something else entirely, honestly? Because I feel like we're getting so much of this conflict so quickly that it almost feels like a red herring, if anything.
Good question. So are we getting enough stakes right away? Probably not. And I think that's probably a function of too much interior explanation of this character's emotions. So it's, again, kind of the show don't tell thing. This is how it feels to live with this demon, but now tell me why. What have you done that makes it feel this way? This is all very suggestive, but in a story like the one I think I'm being told, you're going to need to give me something more concrete up front to make me feel like this matters.
Yeah, I want some more specifics. I have the atmosphere, but I don't have... Good. Yes, for sure. I don't have a time period that I can wrap my head around. I don't know anything about Maya outside of this possession, which it makes me struggle to emotionally connect with her. And if I don't get that at least within the next paragraph, that's probably when I would stop reading, when I would start to feel like she's a cardboard cutout character. So that would be an issue. And yeah, I need a little bit more of the setting. I think that we have a few things. We have good conflict here. We have kind of the emotional appeal that's there. We have the, kind of a little bit of immersion through the writing, but we don't have like an immersive setting. We don't have, I guess we have a little bit of plausibility. So there is some of that. We don't have a ton of originality. I feel like I've watched a bunch of possession things. I've read a bunch of dark fantasy that has possession. I'm not getting the twist. I'm not getting the hook of like, okay, a demon possession, but what separates it from The Exorcist? The sort of possession fantasy, or I guess in the case of The Exorcist, just straight up horror that we all are already familiar with. What makes this fantasy too? Is it the fact that the demon has a name and maybe we get more of the demon? If that's the case, I want that early. I don't want the reader to have to wait super long to get the fantasy element of this.
Yeah, and I would also add on to that, what you have here needs maybe a little bit more, well, I don't know, explanation or just a shift entirely, because when you bring Moloch into the fray here, that's going to be weighted with a whole bunch of historical baggage. And so this Moloch is the name of a evil, dark god in the Bible. I think it was the Canaanite god in the Old Testament. And so, it's like, is this supposed to be a stand-in for Satan? Is this an old god from thousands of years ago? As you say, when is this all taking place? Why is Moloch a part of this? Yeah. I'd like some more explanation there as well.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because it's like, you do want the reader asking questions. Don't get me wrong, but right. You want them asking.
Give it all away.
Yeah, but you don't want them asking too many questions, especially 240 words in. So I guess, yeah, that's the basic, but let's take a look at the prose itself. Okay. The first sentence: possession is a suffocating blackness that wraps around you, tightening like a serpent, coiling to constrict. I think that tightening like a serpent, coiling to constrict is a lot of words that say one thing.
Yep.
But I like the imagery.
I like that. I just tightening, coiling, and constrict, they all are saying the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. And so you can drop that down to say, wraps around you a constricting serpent, or a serpent, constricting or tightening or whatever. You choose one of those words. They all work great.
You can even use I forget what the term is, but you can use the serpent as a stand-in for the demon. So you can transmogrify, I forget what the word is, but you can personify the serpent as the demon itself, tightening like a serpent, having its prey, or like just refer to how she sees the demon possessing her. So you could use that technique, especially though, because to what you say, the next sentence, again, it says it presses in from all sides. Like, again, it's like a fourth time.
Yeah.
We're getting that. And so
squeeze,
we need more. Yeah.
Squeeze, choke, press. Yeah. All these words become unnecessary.
I think the idea is like repetition for emphasis, but what it ends up being is, I feel like my time, I'm not getting enough out of my time. I mean, we're such fickle human beings. We want, we want the dopamine hits.
Yeah.
We don't want to have to, run for our dinner.
And there's a reason why we can be as hard as we are on these few sentences, because, when I analyze an author's prose, I generally go further into the book. I'm at least a third of the way into the book, maybe further, and I'll grab a random sampling from there, because the author is going to be more themselves, more unguarded, further into the book, for good reason. Because in your first page, that first paragraph, those first 3 paragraphs, these matter. You've got to be on your best behavior. So if it sounds like, oh gosh, guys, let it go, that's you're getting nitty gritty here. Like, no, I'm not going to relax, because, as you say, I might not make it past these 3 paragraphs if I'm not grabbed.
Yeah.
I will say the very first thing, before we get to that second sentence further, that first phrase I really liked. Possession is a suffocating blackness that wraps around you. I might even take wraps. Again, there's another one, wraps, tightening, coiling, constrict. I might even take that out. Possession is a suffocating blackness, full stop. Because when I first saw it, I thought, okay, so am I dealing with demonic possession? Answer ends up being yes. But for a moment it was, okay, is it that? Or is this something about consumerism and possession of items in your life, accumulation of items, that sort of thing? Or is it some other type of possession? Is this a relationship issue? So I like the ambiguity of that first sentence that gives that first page room to unfurl a little bit.
I think, though, that's why I like they use the serpent right after, because then that solidifies what we're talking about. So I don't wait too long to know for sure what type of possession this is, to your point. Because then when I see serpent, I immediately think demon, because, this is clearly invoking a lot of biblical stuff. So that puts my head in the right space, so I don't even have to think about what you're really trying to say to me. And isn't that just the trick of writing in general, is that you just want people to understand what you're trying to say? You're just trying to take that image in your head and put it on the page and make sure that there's no lost in translation effect. And so I would hope that that's what they're going for, if they can just kind of, maybe squeeze a few words out if they can. And, I mean, I think you mentioned like an overhaul and everything. I think it's so well said that in terms of just that first sentence, there's so much more you could do to like set the scene and you could distill so much of this down right into that first sentence, and then jump right into something active and something a little bit more scene setting, so that we have a scene instead of, in this case, I think we have mood setting, which it ideally your cover is going to do a lot of mood setting. You might have some kind of like, before chapter 1 starts, you might have some kind of quote that's chilly, that kind of helps set the mood. You don't want to have to, your first chapter, do so much of that work. It's a lot to ask of your first chapter, your first page.
Yeah, I agree. As I said before, I like the idea of starting with a scene of something that the demon has made Maya do, right? And you can do so much with that you referenced earlier. When are we? Where are we? What's going on? If we're going to overhaul this, you give the writer a scene and say, okay, so she is, let's take my example of kneeling over the body of a victim of hers. And well, what's she kneeling on? Is it dirt? Is it cobblestone? Is it brick? Is it pavement? That sort of thing. You're giving little hints. You don't have to come out and say, in the year of our Lord 1938 or whatever, but you can use tiny bits of imagery in a scene to tell me when and where, and then fully explain that later, but at least give my mind something to latch on to.
Literally, you could just say like the brick, like kneeling on the brick of the town's only church.
Right.
That gives me so much with just a few words. And I'm already starting to get into, you don't have to tell me, like you're saying, I don't have to know the year yet. I'll give you a little bit more time to kind of set like, what kind of time period are we dealing with? If it's, a second world, so it's a little bit more ambiguous and timeless, or is it going to be very, alternate to our history or something, and we're going to be in wherever it is, the 1800s, whatever. Yeah, I think that you can pull off a lot of that very quickly without having to, I think, be too super expositionary, whatever that word is correctly. I don't know. Exposition-y? I think that's better.
Expository. Hi,
expository.
Found it.
Thank you. Thank you, person who reads. Yeah, I do like this sentence. The darkness is ravenous. Its hunger for despair insatiable. I think that talking about the demon as darkness and as an abstract, that does start to make me, that starts to give me a little bit more of the person talking. But then I ran into the issue where I'm like, well, this isn't really the character. This is just the narrator. And one of the first things you absolutely have to do especially if you're writing in third person, which I love third person for fantasy, it's my preference, but when you have that extra work you have to do to really make us just kind of like get that character's voice, and we don't get any of it in the first paragraph. I feel like a little tricked because I'm like, I feel like I am getting the voice, but then it goes to her and it turns out it's just the narrator's voice, which I'm less interested in personally. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's too opinionated.
No, I agree. This is one of the reasons why when I am analyzing prose, I'll try to separate out expository prose from dialogue. And so if you have exposition, then it's going to be more in the author's voice, as channeled through a character, versus dialogue, which is, well, that's a whole different beast entirely. And that's kind of what we're running into here. It's obviously not dialogue, but you're switching tenses, you're addressing, who are you addressing and who is addressing? Who is the author addressing and from whom are they addressing that audience? It's all very confusing with that. So you got to dial in where this is all coming from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the more I look at this and I'm hearing what you're saying, the more I kind of wish that we had the first sentence, which, like you've already mentioned, really does have a nice hook to it, just in terms of the vivid imagery. Then I just wish right after the first sentence, just jump right into not she had fought him at first, but Maya had fought him at first.
Yes, please.
So possession is a suffocating blackness that wraps around you, tightening like a serpent, period. Maya had fought the demon at first with all the stubbornness of youth. So 2 sentences there. And we cut a bunch of fluff that you can still incorporate into your story later if you want. You can use some of that imagery to like put us inside of Maya's head. The way that Maya talks about the possession can come up later for that emphasis that I think the writer wants, but you don't have to dump it all here. You can space it out a little bit more if you really want to. But even more so, I think that like just jumping into the second sentence with the character's name, the fact that the character is young, the fact that the character is stubborn and is trying to fight off a demon. Short sentence tells me several important things about the main character, and we're still in the first paragraph. That's what we want.
Agreed. And also, if I'm editing this, I might ask some questions like, what is the stubbornness of youth? Because as a parent, I can tell you that kids can actually be quite pliant. And you speak to an 8-year-old versus an 80-year-old, who's going to be more stubborn, right? And so, little things like that, you're going to want to consider your choices there. But
that is funny because I immediately go to the thought of a toddler. So I'm just like, oh yeah, heck yeah, stubborn.
Well, in a way, certainly, in a way. But anyway, sorry, where were we? Let's get back to it.
We were in sort of a semi-rewrite, but I think just generally like spend way less time explaining the first sentence. I feel like you don't have to explain the first sentence. It does a lot of work on its own. Bring in that main character, make it clear it's third person right away at that point. Because I think I can forgive you if it's just that first sentence, and then it feels a little bit more of like a mood setting, and then we jump right into like, here's some information about the main character and what she's dealing with. I had an immediate reaction to this sentence. The demon had become her constant companion. I don't love that phrasing, constant companion, because I've seen it so many times. I've seen silent constant companion, constant silent companion. It's very, very common. I think I've used it. And like I think it's just like become like nails on a chalkboard to me at this point because it's so overused.
Yeah, that's fair. And also, when I hear a constant companion, that doesn't necessarily come with negative baggage.
Yeah.
The connotation here isn't necessarily fitting with the rest of the paragraphs. So if you're going to go dark, keep it dark. All right. So this isn't your constant companion. It's I don't know
it's
what
a shadow that wants to eat me. Like whatever it takes.
Yeah. Go Le Guin here. It's that following shadow.
Yeah, and there's some good stuff in this sense too. A presence so familiar that was hard to remember a time when he wasn't there. That's just a nice kind of like a flowy sentence, easy to kind of just put me in that sense of like her mindset without using, her thoughts, which we don't need at this point. But yeah, I mean, if we're this close into it, I do want to start getting into that. Okay, but where are we? She's fighting off this demon, but we can get in some of those little details, those little specifics. That would be really, really helpful, I think.
And I would also like to, as we go down the paragraphs, to ask, what sort of imagery do you want to concentrate on here? Because I would like for the author to choose one for now, or to integrate them more seamlessly. Because in the first two paragraphs, we have this tightening, the serpent, the coiling, the squeezing, the wrapping, all of that. And it mentions a ravenous hunger for despair, an insatiable hunger for despair. Okay, and then at the end of the second paragraph, it's feeding off her misery like a parasite. And then boom, we have this switch. It is a good line. We have this switch from squeezing to parasite. And so maybe find a way to incorporate those two pieces of imagery into a more cohesive whole. So if it is serpent, then, it's in her moments of deepest pain or darkness, it sinks its fangs in, kind of more vampiric imagery. So you can marry the idea of a parasite with a serpent, but it was a little bit jarring when those images flipped like that on a dime.
Yeah. And the whole thing about like the original question that Simon is asking is, does the opening of my first chapter hook you in? Well, only a little bit. And I think it could hook me in a lot better. And one of the ways it could is something we've kind of already touched on. You've mentioned this imagery, the parasite, the serpent. It's doing a lot of work to make us feel kind of the despair that the character is feeling. But something else we need is we need that original twist. What makes this different? I know I already kind of brought it up, but like, why is this different from The Exorcist? And there are all kinds of things you can do to make that the case. And we don't know enough about your book to kind of get that sense of what the hook is, but whatever it is, I would bring it up further. But it's little things like, for example, the fact I brought up the brick of a church, if the fact that she's, the daughter of a pastor. And so you immediately have this like tension there of like, she's somebody in the faith or something. Or if you have it be totally different, where it's like the time period is not what you would expect for demon possession. Maybe it's a setting that is completely different. Like we don't usually think of, for example, Siberia, like that kind of character in that kind of setting. We usually think possession of like, 20th century, or we think of the Salem witch trials. We think a lot of like Western and stuff like that. We need something that just kind of like
situates us,
like a marketing, honestly, like something possession that like makes it stand out of like, ooh, I've never heard of a something possession like this before. I'm curious now. Yeah,
it's good. I think of the cover of, what was it, The Possession of Emily Rose, or was that the name of the movie?
Something
I can still see the DVD cover from my college girlfriend who made me watch it. That was an interesting date night. And when you look at a cover, I'm going by memory, so somebody can light me up in the comments if they want to with how wrong I am about what I remember. But you get the shadowy figure of the girl in the background. She's got like the kind of sleep shift on, and there's a house in the background that she's facing toward. And even just that cover situates you with, okay, so there, and the title, not to mention the title.
Yeah, it's The Exorcism of Emily Rose. I'm looking at it now. Yeah, she's like walking toward a tree, kind of like the tree in Sinister.
Okay. So, but it situates you, at least with visually, what you're going to be dealing with. A girl around, in a time when she would have been wearing a night shift like that, being possessed, right? And so that's what you're trying to do with these opening paragraphs, is to give somebody that DVD cover What am I actually dealing with here? And you're definitely getting the mood right. But what am I actually looking at? What's the picture I'm looking at through this kind of dark, foggy lens of pure mood? I'd like a little more information there.
Yeah, I think we're totally agreed. All right, so we've talked about a lot. I'm good to start reading some of the comments. Was there anything else from the excerpt that stuck out to you that you want to pinpoint here? I think we covered a few of the things like the name of the demon and all of that, but there's not too much else I would add at this point.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the last line now. This is where the author chose to cut off their excerpt. So the last line is going to be the flavor that they want to leave with us as readers. And so but her soul was still her own, and she would not let it take that, no matter the cost. It's evocative for sure. Mm-hmm. I really like that line. I'm not to bring that up to critique necessarily even. I'm just saying I like what the author did here and where they cut it off for the Reddit audience that's reading it here.
It's a good combination of gut emotional appeal, this feeling of like she's not going to let it take something from her, but also the inherent conflict that this is what's at stake, her soul being taken. But again, if that is really where this lands, we need to know a little bit more where she's at in the process in terms of how this is affecting her day-to-day life, not just her inner life. And so it's interesting because, of all the excerpts I've read lately, especially, I don't usually see these kinds of problems in them. So I think that's why Natalia sent this, because I think she thought it'd be a little bit more of a tricky one that's a little bit different from like the usual mistakes. But no, it's good. It's good. And I think like we said before, like we would keep reading because there's enough here. I think every time I was starting to maybe kind of lose track a little bit and be like, this is still going on a little bit. I think Simon would really get you with a line that would kind of like keep me in. Like, ooh, she's fighting something. Okay, that's enough for me. And then there'd be like a little bit of like the demon relish the pain it inflicted. I'm like, oh, why? And then I would keep going. So it is doing its job.
No, absolutely. I want to go back to something we were saying at the very, very beginning, which is that while there's plenty to critique and lots to blue pencil underline and all that, whoever wrote this, Simon, clearly has done his fair share of reading and considering, and while there's a lot to fix, I think he's got something here. So far, so good.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
First draft.
Couldn't agree more, yeah. All right, let's take a look at some of these comments and see if we agree or disagree with them. This one's from Stick Twig. Stick Twig says, the best advice I've read about first chapters is the author should explain nothing. Start with events and dialogue. Use the Roomba method to let the world present what it presents. The mysteries uncovered are strong hooks on their own. Explaining too much treats the reader as dumb and takes away the wonder as the setting, characters, and plot are laid out. For these chapters, I'd say that's a hell of a first sentence, absolutely solid. Now, if you ditch the rest of that paragraph and go straight to the second paragraph, how does that read? From there, I think you need dialogue and activity. In this case, I think this introduction has lots of cool stuff, but you've spread it too thick. Use these details as spice across more action and dialogue. So this is a funny comment, Craig, because I agree with 2/3 of it. I don't like the first thing they say, though, like explain nothing. Maybe they're just being cheeky, because I agree with everything else. But
So much of advice like that is, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard was this guy that I worked for who was advising dentists. Okay, it doesn't matter on what, but he said, look, my advice is going to be good for 90% of you 90% of the time. And so when I use generalities, just be aware that there are lots of exceptions to that rule, and you may be the exception to that rule, that sort of thing. So that's always stuck with me. And I think about it with something like this. The best advice I've read about first chapters is the author should explain nothing. Well, okay, directionally, maybe that's onto something, but 90% of the time you can take that 90% of the way, but you got to give me something. You can't explain nothing. Well, okay, I was going to use an example of a very popular author, but I will not do so.
Yeah. Yes, I think I have an idea of it. I think it all comes down to like, how do you define explaining? Some people might say of like explaining is a little bit too expository, just in terms of like, and the reason that the demon is doing this is because, which, I don't even think that Simon is necessarily doing.
No, it's not that bad.
Yeah. So really good advice though. I think that, we said a lot of the same stuff here. No wonder I'm saying I think it's good. But jumping into the second paragraph, really smart. idea.
Yeah, I had the same thought, which was, where should this have started, or where could this have started? And as I'm reading through, the demon had become her constant companion. Well, we talked about not loving that particular phrase, constant companion, but change that up, and it could be an interesting first sentence or second sentence, right? Finding ways to cut down your word count as much as humanly possible. It's not, you're not doing it for any reason other than you only have so much time to hook the reader. So cut out some of those words just for the sake of getting to your point faster.
Yes, we are aligned. All right, let's take a look at one or two more comments here. Blades FTW said, my 2 cents, you're just telling a bunch of stuff and it makes it a bit boring to read. You say her hands moved on their own, but why not make a scene where she suffocates someone against her will? I'd say that's the biggest problem. And then there's some parts that are a bit wordy, saying the same thing. Yeah, so I guess, Craig, we're not going to find a lot of disagreement in the comments here.
Apparently not, yeah.
I think this person a month ago heard you talk in the future. And no, but yeah, it's good to know that we're not scrambling over here.
It's another cliche that's a cliche for good reason, and that's in medias res. All right. And so if you've ever taken a single writing class, you've heard this Latin phrase, and it just means in the middle of the action. So when you start in medias res, then you're starting with something happening. And there's a reason why so much of the media that we consume in any genre does that. So I win. Start with your character with bloody hands, and now tell me why. Yeah, I love the idea of, like I said before, this is a great starting point. You're giving me something to work with as far as the mood and the atmosphere and what the character is feeling, but now give me something that she's feeling it over. And so she's leaning down, choking this person and bawling, like tears streaming down her face, and the demon is just, your tears are delicious. No. Right. It's soaking up that despair that she feels over having to do this thing, being made to do this thing.
Well, I hope you're not speaking from experience with that last part there, but okay, so before we go, I did want to kind of finish with this because I'm sure maybe a few folks are listening and they're like, you guys are too harsh, chill out. But if this is so, if this is so easy to critique, what's an example of a really good, opening, 100 or so words? Right before we started this recording, Craig doesn't know I'm doing this, I just grabbed a couple of books off my shelf. And I was like, what are some books where I'm like, this would be a really good example of like an opening paragraph or two?
Yeah.
I took 2 off here. I have them. I'll put them up to the camera for you, Craig. We have House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, of course. Good fave of mine. And The Black Prism. I mean, I had to grab a classic since I have Craig Hanks on, I guess. Actually, I don't even know if you like The Black Prism now that I think about it.
Brent is a friend of mine, and
I
beta
read the book.
4th book. No, The Black Prism. I love those books. I have reasons, but people can listen to the Legendarium to hear my reasons why I love those books.
There you go. Perfect. I want to start with House in the Cerulean Sea because it's a good example of like a cozy fantasy, which I know is all the rage these days. And so I wanted to give an example of that since I know a few folks in the community especially have said, oh yeah, I want to write a cozy. So here's how TJ Klune starts their book. Oh dear, Linus Baker said, wiping the sweat from his brow, this is most unusual. That was an understatement. He watched in rapt wonder as an 11-year-old girl named Daisy levitated blocks of wood high above her head. The blocks spun in slow, concentric circles. Daisy frowned in concentration. The tip of her tongue stuck out between her teeth. It went on for a good minute before the blocks slowly lowered to the floor. Her level of control was astounding. I love this opening bit. It tells me so much about Daisy. It's like we were saying, it tells me her age. It tells me something unique and special about her, a hook, that she has this power, and the fact that somebody is watching her and evaluating her. I'm hooked. I'm in. I'm ready to go. And it does break the rule of starting with dialogue, but I do think cozy fantasy for the most part tends to get away with that, in my opinion.
Again, 90% of the time for 90% of you. There are ways and times that you can break the rules, but you got to know the rules first.
100%. And then I'll read Black Prism because this opening, it's one of my favorite openings to a fantasy novel. Because I remember when I first read it, I was just like, oh my gosh, like this guy knows how to kind of hook you in a lot faster than I felt hooked in when I first read Game of Thrones or when I first read Wheel of Time. I just felt like chapter 1 of Black Prism really gets you. So chapter 1, Kip crawled toward the battlefield in the darkness, the mist pressing down, blotting out sound, scattering starlight. Though the adults shunned it and the children were forbidden to come here, he'd played on the open field 100 times during the day. Tonight, his purpose was grimmer. If that doesn't just get you intrigued, and you know what I notice every time I read that paragraph, it's just one paragraph, not a lot of adjectives, not a lot of complicated phrasing or telling me that this is the land of blah, blah, blah. I just know that this kid named Kip came to play or usually plays in this area, but now he has to do something kind of dark and dangerous. Yeah. And that's all I need to know.
And it's a point that we were talking about earlier, situating your reader, even just using the word battlefield. It tells you a little bit about what type of world you're about to get into. We don't really talk about battlefields as much in modern terms. So we're probably dealing with a sword and sorcery type thing rather than, flintlock fantasy or something.
And I guess the cover helps too.
Well, there is that.
There's the dagger. There's the name of the story.
Oh, I've got funny stories about that cover.
Oh, perfect. Well, Craig Hanks, thank you so much for going through this with me. It was a lot of fun. I felt like, hopefully we provided some insight on folks who are really wanting to polish that first paragraph or so. And yeah, it was a true pleasure.
I appreciate you bringing me on and hope that if people enjoy this sort of thing, there are a few videos on our YouTube channel where I've, dived deep on prose, and you might enjoy checking that out at the Legendarium.
It's great stuff. Yeah, subscribe on YouTube, subscribe on your podcast app of choice, of course. If you have any show feedback for Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Check out our Discord as well. All that stuff is in the show notes, including a link to the prompts we looked at today, as well as Craig Hanks' podcast, The Legendarium, and all that good stuff. So thank you so much for listening, everyone. We'll be back on another date. In the meantime, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.